70,000 people are here, and Bob Dylan is the reason for it.
Inspired by the true story.
For anyone who's gonna hold your attention on a stage, you have to kind of be a freak.
Are you a freak?
Hope so.
And starring Timothée Chalamet as Bob Dylan. He defied everyone.
Turn it down!
Play loud!
To change everything.
Make some noise, BD.
Timothée Chalamet, Edward Norton, Elle Fanning, Monica Barbaro. A complete unknown. Only in theaters Christmas Day. Rated R. Under 17, not admitted without parent.
This episode is brought to you by Shopify. Upgrade your business with Shopify, home of the #1 checkout on the planet. Shop Pay boosts conversions up to 50%, meaning fewer carts going abandoned and more sales going cha-ching. So if you're into growing your business, get a commerce platform that's ready to sell wherever your customers are. Visit Shopify.com to upgrade your selling today.
And thanks for joining us for the Q&A podcast produced by C-SPAN. I'm your host, Peter Slen. Our guest this week is the owner of the World Trade Center, who bought the Twin Towers in New York City in July of 2001, just 2 months before the 9/11 terrorist attacks. That podcast begins in just a moment. Well, Larry Silverstein is 93 years old. He's a real estate developer in New York City. And when he was 70, he bought the Twin Towers World Trade Center complex. That was in July of 2001, just before the terrorist attacks brought his buildings down on 9/11. He was supposed to be having breakfast that morning on the 102nd floor of the North Tower, but his wife insisted he keep his doctor's appointment. Mr. Silverstein has penned a new memoir entitled The Rising. In it, he looks back at his life and career and talks about the rebuilding of the World Trade Center in Lower Manhattan. This interview was conducted on the 80th floor of the World Trade Center Tower. That podcast begins now. Larry Silverstein, where are we?
As I recall, we're on the 80th floor of 3 World Trade Center.
How many buildings are in this complex?
Well, there's number 1, which we used to know as the Freedom Tower. Then there's tower number 3, tower number 4. We're shortly going to be talking about tower number 2. There's tower number 7. So you put it all together and you end up with about 10 plus million square feet of space, office space.
Who owns it?
Actually, the Port of New York Authority owns the land. And we lease the land from them for a period of 99 years. I signed that lease when I was 70 years of age. So clearly, at some point, they're going to have to come back and renegotiate the extension of that lease when it matures in 99 years.
This complex is built on what site?
It's built on the site of the original World Trade Center, the Twin Towers, as it was known. And it's about an 18-acre site in total. And it served as the locomotive for all the business activities that happened in Lower Manhattan once the Trade Center was completed. Its impact on the financial district was total. And it became not just a place where 10 million square feet of office users were stationed, but it became a place where you also had about 500,000 square feet of retail. Below it were 11 mass transit lines, plus the path tubes to New Jersey, which made access to each of the boroughs simple. You could reach any place in the metropolitan area from the Twin Towers, and vice versa. You go back and forth easily.
You've written a book, The Rising, the 22-year battle to rebuild the World Trade Center. How much did it cost you personally to build this complex?
Well, there's a long answer to that question. But initially I paid $3.2 billion to acquire the 99-year lease on the Twin Towers, on the World Trade Center. Since then, in the last 20 plus years, we've spent about $10 billion to replace the buildings. The Port Authority spent about another $10 billion to replace the infrastructure. You put it all together, between us, we spent about $20 billion to replace what I originally paid $3.2 billion to acquire.
There's a difference between land cost or rent and air rights, correct?
Yes.
And where do you fit into this?
We fit into it by virtue of purchasing a lease on the ground, right? And which gave us the ability to go up with these buildings and to enjoy the use of 10 million square feet of office space, plus about 500,000 square feet of retail. So it was from a commercial standpoint, it was a very attractive acquisition. And there were, of the 10 million square feet, 40 tenants occupied 7 million of the 10 million feet. So those tenants were critically important to the Trade Center and the rationale behind acquiring the center, because the rent potential, the upside was significant. Of course, no one ever anticipated 9/11 and changed everything, obviously.
Well, let's go back to 1957. There's a gentleman named Larry Silverstein who buys a building in New York.
That was our first acquisition. And when my father started as a real estate broker, and I joined him, and making a living in those days as a broker in the location which we found ourselves in, which is Lower Manhattan. It was a very difficult time, and making a living was extremely difficult. And I realized that if I was to remain a real estate broker, earning a decent living to provide for a wife and children, myself, would be not terribly attractive, would be tough. So I finally said to my dad one day, I said, it seems to me we're going to starve to death continuing to function as we are. The area in which we functioned was Lower Broadway, essentially from Houses Street down to Canal Street, maybe a little below that. And it was an area really known as the rag and the woolen district. Didn't have much going for it, and values were way down. Buildings you could acquire a 7-story elevator building for $2,500. There wasn't much value down here, and so I remember seeing an article, I think in the Wall Street Journal, where it described the acquisition by two men, one Lawrence Wien, an attorney, real estate attorney, another by Harry Helmsley, a real estate broker. And together they bought the Empire State Building by going to 5,000 investors to invest $5,000 each to become a limited partner in the acquisition of the Empire State Building. I remember looking at that and saying to my father, I said, you know what? This is the way to do it. This is the way to go. We have no money. We have no resources. We can't borrow any money from the banks because we had no collateral. I said, but why can't we do what they did? So I spent some time getting the material and analyzing what they did and how they did it. And to acquire our first building, at 220 East 23rd Street, which at that time was Pittsville. It was really not a very good location in Manhattan. And the building was old, dilapidated, poorly maintained, dirty, heavily vacant. Its facilities were totally uninspiring. As a matter of fact, they gave you a negative impression when you walked upon the vacant floors. What we did was to find 25 investors to invest $10,000 each in enabling us to acquire this building at 220 East 23rd Street. Once we acquired it, the question was, what do you do now? How do you make this building worth at least what we paid for it, and maybe a little bit more? And so my father looked at it and he said, you know what? Let's get somebody to whitewash the floors, whitewash the space. So in those days, you can come in with a spray gun and spray everything. There were no limitations of any kind. And then we got somebody to wash the windows because the windows hadn't been washed in years. We got the superintendent to hang some used fluorescent lights that we bought from an Army Navy store, used lights, which the superintendent hung from the ceiling on the floors. And then we got somebody to scrape the floors because there was such filth on those floors. There were 80 or 90 years worth of muck on them, and they're just terrible. And when they started scraping, it was amazing to see the fine hardwood quality floors under the muck. And when all that muck was removed, the space began to look as something that's worth the rent. Right? So we ended up, by virtue of doing this, we ended up getting 50 cents a foot for that space, significantly higher than we anticipated achieving. And by virtue of achieving a higher rent for the space, we were able to make distributions to the investors of 1% a month, 12% a year, which at that time was pretty good. So they were excited, and they said, you know what, we like this, find another building. So we went out and find a second one. So the second one was more expensive than the first. And we did something similar, and again, that succeeded. So then we went on to a third and a fourth and so forth. And after a while, the banks that would never lend us 5 cents because we had no collateral for them called us and they said, you know, you have needs, we like what you're doing, come to us, whatever you have a need for, we'll provide. So you don't have to go to your investors. It was a sea change in our lives, because then suddenly we had the capability of going out, seeing something we liked, and we could make a deal to acquire it.
Mr. Silverstein, you were not born into a real estate family, is that correct?
Correct.
You were born across the East River over here.
In Brooklyn, not far from the Gowanus Canal. The stench in that area was horrendous when the wind blew from the wrong direction. So it was I say facetiously, we lived on the 7th floor of a 6-story walk-up. They were difficult times, really difficult. And, but as a result of acquisition of a group of buildings, things began to change for us in a very material way.
Is it fair to call you the owner of the World Trade Center? Is that an accurate title?
There is a legal title, which is different. But in terms of the realities, in terms of operating the buildings, being responsible for them, being able to mortgage them, being able to finance them, being able to lease them, the answer is yes.
Larry Silverstein, in your book, The Rising, you talk about an incident in January of 2000 when you were 79 years old at the corner of 57th and Madison. What happened?
I was walking home from a restaurant where there was a party, a real estate party, all the three contenders for the real estate of the Trade Center we were all there, and the room was crowded with real estate people, one type or another, brokers and such. And the general consensus was the two major players, two real estate investment trusts, Boston Properties, who had combined with Brookfield, was one player. Another was Vornado, major real estate investment trust. And that was us. We were small by comparison. They were major owners of massive amounts of real estate around the country, highly recognized, so forth. And so the consensus, clear as a bell, Silverstein, they don't have a chance. These two massive players, one of them is going to take it. What they didn't appreciate was the fact that we had an experience with the Port Authority that went back to 1987. We had built a 2 million square foot building on the original Trade Center site, and it was a very successful affair. It was great for the Port Authority, great for us, and the net result is we'd had a relationship with the Port Authority that was solid. And working with the Port Authority as a private entrepreneur was relatively easy. So that night, walking home from this function, getting to 57th Street and Madison Avenue, green light, I started across the street. Out of nowhere came a driver who was intoxicated, slammed into me, broke my pelvis in 11 places. The pain was excruciating. I thought I was dead, except for the pain. I knew I wasn't dead, but it felt like I was going to never survive this. And so, got to the hospital, ambulance, so forth, and I said, please, the pain is terrible, give me morphine. So they gave me morphine. And I woke up a couple of days later, saw a nurse, and I said, can you tell me what day this is? And she said it was the 28th day of January. I looked at her, and I said, number one, kill the morphine. Number two, get me a conference room, get me a big room, get me telephones. I have to get a group of people in here. She said, no morphine, you're gonna feel it. I said, I can't help it. Because by that time we had a couple of $1 million invested in analyzing the Trade Center and preparing the bid. So sure enough, our people came and we determined what the bid was that we were gonna make, $3.2 billion. And so we in a timely fashion, we got our bid in by the 30th, which is the final day. And some period of time after that, I was on my way home in the car and we got a call, and from J.P. Morgan, the people representing the Port Authority for the sale of the Trade Center. And they said, Mr. Silverstein, you did not make it. Vornado made it. I said, how much? They submitted a bid of $3.25 billion. And I said, what about Boston Properties and Brookfield? They said that they came in at $3.15 billion. So there's $50 million between the low bid, Boston Properties and Brookfield, $3.15 billion, my bid of $3.2 billion, and the winning bid, Vornado, $3.25 billion. So $50 million, a lot of money, but just a rounding error when you're dealing with $3+ billion. So I remember saying to myself, God, I lost this damn thing by $50 million. Really a heartbreaker. And once I realized we lost it, I thought about it and I said to myself, I really got terrific financing from General Motors Sept Corporation. Not in business today, but they were then. And so I called Steve Roth of Vornado, the winning bidder, And I said, Steve, we have this terrific financing. I can't use it, so you might as well take it. So I gave him the information and so forth, told him who to call. And he said, Larry, very generous. You really appreciate it. Okay.
This episode is brought to you by LifeLock. The holidays mean more travel, more shopping, more time online, and more personal info in places that could expose you to identity theft. That's why LifeLock monitors millions of data points every second. If your identity is stolen, their US-based restoration specialist will fix it, guaranteed or your money back. Get more holiday fun and less holiday worry with LifeLock. Save up to 40% your first year. Visit LifeLock.com/podcast. Terms apply.
¿Hablas español?
Sprichst du Deutsch?
Komm du noch?
If you've heard that sound from Babbel before, I bet you do. Babbel is the science-backed language learning app that actually works. With quick 10-minute lessons handcrafted by over 200 language experts, Babbel gets you on your way to speaking a new language in just a few weeks. With over 16 million subscriptions sold and a 20-day money-back guarantee, just start speaking another language with Babbel. Right now, up to 55% off your Babbel subscription at babbel.com/Spotify podcast. Spelled BABBEL.com/Spotify podcast. Rules and restrictions may apply.
About 19 days later, I got a telephone call from J.P. Morgan in their capacity as representing the sale of the Trade Center. And they said, are you still interested in the Trade Center? And I said, why do you ask? They said, because Vornado is not going to make the deal. I said, you got to be kidding. These are professional people. What happened? They said, well, Vornado can't respond affirmatively to the demands of the Port Authority. And the result is there's just 2 days left, and they don't trust the Port Authority. The Port Authority no longer trusts them. So I said, before I do anything, I'm calling Vornado to confirm what you're telling me. They said, go ahead and call. So I did. Spoke to Steve. I said, Steve, what happened? He told me. He said, I can't. I said, I'm a public company. The things that the Port Authority is asking me to do, I can't do. Legally, I can't do it. So this deal, we're not going to make it. He said, if you're interested, you might as well close it. So I said, okay. I said, I need your contract. You've been negotiating the contract. Give me the terms of your deal. He said, Larry, I spent a lot of money for that. I said, wait a minute. Are you asking me to pay for this? He said, well, this has been very costly for me. I said, I gave you the terms of my financing. I said, you're asking me to pay now? He said, Larry, you're just a more generous guy than I am. So I said, okay, Steve, thank you very much. And that was it. Went back to the port and said, okay, let's close it. Let's do it. Let's do the deal. So I said, but I want the same terms that you've negotiated with Steve. Otherwise, if you're giving me 21 days to close it, it'll never happen in a timely fashion. So I need his terms. So they finally gave me the terms that he negotiated. It didn't cost me anything at the result. But nevertheless, 21 days later, we took title to the Trade Center. That was during the month of July of 2001.
July 2001, you bought the lease. Is that a fair way of saying it?
Correct.
For the Twin Towers.
Correct.
September 11th, 2001. What would you normally be doing on a Tuesday morning?
I mentioned that there were 40 tenants occupying 7 million of the 10 million square feet. So every day, which I took title afterward, right, to the 9/11, I spent every morning with tenants. My first requirement was make a breakfast date at Windows on the World, top of the North Tower, and sit with the tenant, sometimes 2, sometimes 3, as many as I could pack in, find out what their needs were and so forth, because that was where the potential was. It was the basis of my thinking was rents at the Twin Towers averaged $35 a foot. I had recently before my acquisition, before I closed, I signed a lease at 140 Broadway, another building that I owned at the time, downtown. And I signed a lease with Brown Brothers Harriman, 500,000 feet for the lower 20 floors of 140 Broadway. And I got $50 a foot. The view from the lower 40 floors in the building were not good. They were nowhere near the incredible views from the 110-story Twin Towers. But the interesting thing is, the lower floors in the Twin Towers, $35 a foot. Halfway up, $35 a foot. Top of the $35 a foot. Didn't make any sense to me. I said to myself, there's huge potential here. And that's why I was having breakfast with each one of those tenants to determine what to do, how to do it, what their needs were, how can I work with them to renew their leases at a higher rent. 9/11 changed all that in a very material way.
Why were you not at Windows of the World on that morning?
Because on that morning, I was dressing to go downtown to Windows on the World to meet with tenants, breakfast. And my wife said, "Where are you going?" I said, "I'm going down to the Trade Center." She said, "You can't go." And I said, "Why not?" She said, "I made an appointment for you with a dermatologist. Light skin, light colored hair, major problem." And so every time I went to the dermatologist, sure enough, they found a problem. So they cut it off. So it was a constant issue. So I said, "Sweetheart, I'll go next month." She said, "You canceled last month, you canceled the month before. You've got to go." And she started getting upset. Now, when you're married to the same woman for 45 years, and she gets angry, she gets upset. I said, "Okay, please, don't get upset, don't get angry. The words are yes, I'll do anything you want me to do, but don't get upset." So she calmed down. But as a result, I never made it that morning. And thank God I didn't, because otherwise I wouldn't be here talking to you. Just that simple.
How did you find out what happened?
I made it. Actually, I got a call from the captain of our boat, which at that time was at the West Side Piers, the Chelsea Piers. And he could see from where the boat was tied up at the dock. He could see down the Trade Center, and he could see the first building.
He called the house?
He called the house. And he said, "Is Mr. Silverstein okay?" And my wife said, "Yeah, why do you ask? He's fine. Why do you ask?" The captain said, "Turn on your television set." So we turned the set, and sure enough, we saw the first building in flames, the North Tower, and then we could watch the second plane come down, make a U-turn to come up to destroy the South Tower. That's when we knew there was a terrible, terrible problem here. Terrible. Because we had 2 children working with us in my firm in space, temporary space that the Port Authority gave us, pending our removal into the Twin Towers. We're moving our offices from Midtown into the Trade Center. And so our temporary offices were on the 90th floor of the North Tower. We got extremely lucky. Lucky in that the first plane hit at about 9:15, 15 minutes before conventional opening time. My children were on their way down to the office. My son got there in time to see the North Tower in flames. My daughter was on her way down to the North Tower and got word of what happened because the police stopped her. And so they put her in the car, they put her in their car, the police car, and drove her to our offices. So their lives were saved. As it turns out, we lost the lives of 4 of our employees. They had 8 children among them. And being in the office that afternoon, experiencing loved ones coming to the office, and asking about their fathers, their sons, daughters, whatever, their loved ones. The later it got, the more it became obvious that they probably didn't make it. And it was a terrible time. Just a horrendous time.
In your book, The Rising, Mr. Silverstein, you talk about receiving 3 phone calls the next morning. The first from Governor Pataki, George Pataki.
He called, and it was about 7 o'clock in the morning. And he said, Larry, what do you think we ought to do? And I remember telling him that I felt it was important to rebuild the Trade Center. And he said, why? I said, because it's the stimulant, it's the locomotive that brings all of this business activity to Lower Manhattan. I said, it's got to be replaced, because if you don't, Lower Manhattan's going to become a ghost town. People are going to leave it, they'll never come back. I said, secondly, if we don't rebuild it, we're going to give the terrorists exactly what they wanted. I said, this is an attack, not on the Twin Towers, nothing like that. Much more serious. It's an attack on America and everything we stand for. So we have an obligation to rebuild it. That's what I see. He said, well, what would you do? Would you put back the Twin Towers? And I said, off the top of my head, probably not. I said, probably, instead of building 210-story towers, 5 million square feet each, I said, maybe I'd build 4 towers, 2.5 million feet each. So it's slightly different, but I said, rebuilding, I think, is an absolute necessity.
The second phone call from a friend of yours named Herb Wachtel.
I met in September of 1944 in the freshman class of the High School of Music and Art. A guy my age, actually a year younger. Herb Wachtel was his name. We became friends that way. So we were in high school together, college together, and we've known each other for all these years. I remember having dinner with him and his family and our family and so forth the weekend before 9/11 in his home. So very good friends. And I recall right after 9/11 realizing that I had one hell of a problem before me. I remember talking to her and his partner, Marty Lipton, Wachtel Lipton, the law firm that he started, and which grew into one of New York's most prominent law firms. And so next question was, okay, what do we do from this point on? So I asked them to represent us, which they finally agreed to do. They had to make a decision because this was going to affect them in a very significant way. If they did this, they sensed that it would cause them to forego other representations during the same period of time because they realized this was going to be a major undertaking, which it proved to be. And so, but having their guidance turned out to be invaluable.
The third phone call you received, Ariel Sharon.
I had external interests other than my business and my family. And I became interested in the United Jewish Appeal and Federation for Jewish Philanthropies. We raised a significant amount of money from New Yorkers, the Jewish community in New York. And that money was destined for humanitarian aid to people in New York. Jews, Gentiles, blacks, whites, gays, straights. If you're a human being, you had humanitarian needs, you can come to any one of our 100 social service network agencies in this city and help people who desperately needed humanitarian help, regardless of religion or color or anything else. I became involved in that charitable endeavor. Turns out to be the largest local charity in the world. At some point they asked me to become chairman of the board. They said, give us a year. As it turns out, I gave them 3 years. But as a result, I got to work with each one of the Israeli prime ministers, from Yitzhak Shamir all the way through Bibi Netanyahu. And one of the prime ministers who I got to know very well was Arik Sharon. I spent a good deal of time going back and forth to Israel, being chairman of UJ Federation. And I got to meet his wife, his family. They had a farm. And when my secretary said, call was coming in from Israel, I just assumed it was Arik Sharon. So I picked up the phone and I said, Arik? He said, Larry, how are you? I said, in all due honesty, I am in the deepest funk of my life because there's no way to figure out what's going to happen next. There's no news, there's no sense of what the portent is for tomorrow or the next day or the next week. It's just, we've never had anything like this in America. There's no precedent. So there's no way to know what we're facing. So he said, well, we're terribly worried about you. So I said, I looked at the clock and I realized it was 6 o'clock in New York. Israel, it was either midnight or 1 o'clock in the morning, I forget which. And I said, Arik, you're prime minister of the state of Israel. You're fighting an intifada. You have all kinds of obligations. You have to protect the country. I said, my recommendation is don't worry about me. I'll worry about myself. You should get off the phone and go to sleep. Are you in the office or on the farm? He said, no, I'm at the farm. I said, okay, go to sleep. I'll take care of myself. You take care of yourself. He said, okay, but we're worried about you. I said, don't worry. I'll take care of me. You take care of you. Because it sort of snapped back, and I suddenly realized it was important for him to get his rest because of his obligations.
I want to read a quote from the book. I had no idea, nor in truth could I have imagined, that for the next 2 decades I would be caught up in an arduous and all too often frustrating process, a series of head-to-head battles fueled by politics, power, and money, with nothing less than the future of New York City as the economic capital of the world at stake. I would witness colossal government ineptitude, the promiscuous spending of public money as years blithely passed and the construction overruns totaled billions of dollars. I could go to war against intransigent insurance companies to force them simply to honor the contracts they signed and the millions of dollars in premium checks they'd cashed. I would see my name and reputation besmirched in the press as cynical politicians scrambled to deflect the blame for their mistakes and delays. Larry Silverstein, in the rebuilding, where do you start?
It's an interesting question. There were no precedents. Nothing had ever happened in America with this degree of complexity. Also, the involvement of so many public officials. New York State, New Jersey, own the Port Authority by state agency. So the two governors, then the Port Authority, executive directors of the Port Authority, a board of the Port Authority, mayor of the city of New York, then a whole host of other state agencies, federal. Of course, at the very beginning, the next thing I knew, I think within a day or two, there were federal troops all over Lower Manhattan. I couldn't go near my own property, not that I wanted to, because the stench was terrible. The odor was horrendous, and a lot of people, many people lost their lives as a result of trying to help rescue people they didn't know, on the assumption that there were still survivors in there. And the sad thing was, the complexities were so great, the lawyers came to a conclusion early on that it was important to start with the problems that were most easily solved. Forget about the problems that they couldn't ascertain how the hell they were going to deal with them. But the problems that were most easily solved, the easiest ones, were the first ones they would tackle. So instead of trying to go from A to Z, they went from A to B, and from B to C, and C to D, piece by piece by piece by piece. And that was the only way they could possibly conclude agreements with respect to the totality of such a complex transaction.
This episode is brought to you by Amazon. The holidays are here, and you know what that means. It's time to get your friends and family the gifts they deserve. Take the stress out of shopping with Amazon's great deals and low prices on a huge range of items from toys to tech and much more. Whoever you're gifting for, Amazon has great prices on everything you need this holiday season. Shop last-minute deals now.
This episode is brought to you by Etsy.
Oh.
Hear that?
Okay. Thank you.
Etsy knows these aren't the sounds of holiday gifting. Well, not the ones you're hoping for. You want squeals of delight. Happy tears.
How did you?
And spontaneously written songs of joy.
I am so happy. Oh yeah, oh yeah, oh yeah.
Okay, the song needs a bit of work, but anyway, to get those reactions, make sure everyone on your list feels heard with handmade, handpicked, and designed gifts from small shops on Etsy. Gifts like personalized jewelry, custom artwork, cozy style items, vintage pieces, and home decor to celebrate all of your favorite people and their specific kind of special. For original gifts that say, I get you, Etsy has it.
You talk about going to Washington, and I bring this up because you, again, had just been hit by the car a year earlier. You have your walker walking through the halls of Washington, D.C., meeting with Senator Schumer and Senator Hillary Clinton. There was this legislation called liability parity legislation. What exactly is that?
The federal government was asked to provide liability legislation because anybody who was involved in any way with the transaction was going to be litigated by people, families of survivors lost their lives. So Herb Wachtell and Marty Lipton told me the first thing you have to do is go to Washington and get yourself liability parity legislation from the federal government. I said, okay, how do I do that? He said, you have to speak to the members of the House, the leadership of the House, leadership of the Senate, the White House, so forth. You've got to get the House, the Senate, the White House to give you the same protection as they're giving the airlines, because the airlines are being litigated as well. Okay? They said, because if you don't get it, you're going to be facing wrongful death actions for the rest of your life. You'll never be able to do anything. Forget about rebuilding the trade center. You've just got to get this. You got to do it quickly. So they said, who do you know? I said, I know Chuck Schumer, I know Hillary Clinton. They said, well, call whoever you want to call, but you got to start. You got to get this. So I remember calling both. Called Chuck Schumer, who I knew, Hillary Clinton, who I knew. And Chuck was the first one to respond to my call. And I said, Chuck, I need liability legislation. Can you help me? He said, Larry, you're entitled to it. I know you. I've been knowing you for years. You're a good guy. I'll get this for you. So I said, appreciate it. Next thing I know, Hillary Clinton calls back. I told her the conversation I just had with Chuck. She said, Larry, if he tells you he's going to give it to you, he's going to get it for you. He'll get it, right? But if you need my help with any way, call, because I'm there for you. And she was. I mean, they were terrific. So the first move was to find a group of political advisors who could represent our interests and pave the way for meetings with the leaders of the House, leaders of the Senate, the White House. Lobbyists. And so everybody we went to already had contacts. They were already representing people. Therefore, there was a conflict of interest for them. We finally found one group, Quinn and Gillespie. Jack Quinn, who was formerly counsel for Bill Clinton when he was president, and
Ed Gillespie.
Ed Gillespie, right?
Former chair of the Republican National Committee.
So one was Democrat, the other was Republican. So Jack Quinn set up meetings with Democrats, Ed Gillespie meetings with the Republicans, and at that time, walking was a difficult problem. Still recovering from the automobile accident. And I remember the only way you could do this is you have to go to Washington and meet the senators, meet the representatives, go to the White House. And so my wife, I told her, I said, sweetheart, I need your help.
And this is Clara.
This is Clara. Best wife I ever had. Of all my wives, she's the best by far. And so
we should be clear that there's been one.
Only one.
Yeah.
And we're together only 68 years. It's been a joyous relationship. I couldn't ask for a better wife. Just so tremendously lucky. And nevertheless, but I said, sweetheart, can you come with me? Because walking is going to be tough. So of course she did. And those buildings in Washington, they have a 12-story height limitation. So instead of being tall, they're spread, right? Walking those corridors was hell. Absolutely hell, because they're marble floors. Walking on stone, walking on marble. Lengthy corridors, going forever, was a horror. Just a terrible experience. But nevertheless, we made it through each one of those meetings. It was really a fascination as to how things get done, because each of the members of the Senate had assistants. They had legislative assistants, they had legal assistants, they had policy assistants, they had political assistants, all kinds of assistants. And they were young people, bright people. It was just a fascination, because if a senator didn't get something, it was the young people who understood exactly what the circumstances were, explained to the senators what was needed here, and the response for every one of them was totally positive. They said, "You're entitled to it. We're going to get it for you." And so, on the Republican side, on the Democratic side, and the House, it's really just wonderful. Members of the House were not quite as sharp as the members of the Senate. Not in every case, but in some cases. And I found that these young legislative assistants, they were there, they understood exactly what the problem was, sometimes before the representative did, and they were extremely helpful. And so slowly but surely we made our way House, Senate, and it was just a pleasure, because every place I went, it was easy. They understood the circumstances. White House, we were given 15 minutes on the west wing of the White House. As it turns out, we were there for about, I don't know, 3/4 of an hour, because they asked all kinds of questions. And so, everybody was affirmative. We were making tremendous progress, almost finished. And Chuck Schumer called me, and he said, "Larry, we have a terrible problem." I forget the name of the senator.
Don Nichols, Republican of Oklahoma at the time.
So he said, "Larry, he doesn't like developers. He doesn't like Jewish developers. He doesn't like Jewish developers from New York." He said, "We've got a real problem with him. If he decides to hold this legislation from coming to the floor, there's nothing we could do. We're dead." He said, "So you gotta get him." So I remember calling UJ Federation, and I said, "How much did the Jewish community raise for the federal building that was demolished in Oklahoma City? How much did they raise for it?" Turns out they raised $10 million, and they're a fraction of the general population of Oklahoma City. So when I came to Senator Nichols' office, went in, and he said, "Please sit down." So Cora and I sat down, and Ed Gillespie arranged that meeting, so he was with us. And I started telling Senator Nichols exactly what I told everybody else, the House, the Senate, the White House. And I could see that his face looked as if it was chiseled in stone. There was no emotional response. I got an emotional response from everyone I told the story to, but not him. So I talked for a few minutes, and I said to myself, "Stop and see what comes out of him." And he listened to me, and he said, "Mr. Silverstein," he said, "World Trade Center was hit in New York, the world stops. Federal building in Oklahoma City came down, the world didn't stop. Everybody's running to New York, nobody's coming to Oklahoma City." I said, "Well, Senator, in all due deference, this is an attack on America. The Twin Towers, not just the Twin Towers. These people are trying to destroy everything that our country represents. Our values, our structure, everything." I said, "So it's not just the Twin Towers. It's an attack on everything our democracy stands for. And they're trying to bring it down." So he said, "Well, Mr. Silverstein, I'm not impressed." He said, your people haven't done anything to help us." I said, "In all due deference, Senator, that's not true." I said, "I've just ascertained that the Jewish community in Oklahoma City contributed $10 million to the effort to help the people who lost their lives, so forth, the families." I said, "And the Jewish community in Oklahoma City is just a fraction of the population of the entire city." I said, "So, that's the fact. I just ascertained that." He said, "Well, Mr. Silverstein, I'm not impressed." I suddenly felt my heart beating, and I said to myself, "If I don't get out of here, I'm going to have a heart attack." So I remember saying, "Senator, thank you for your time." And I stood up and started walking out. As I'm walking out, his legislative aide takes my hand, gives me a warm handshake, and says, "We're going to help you." I get outside, and I said, "Ed Gillespie," I said, "Ed, this is a disaster." He said, "This is a terrific meeting." He said, "How can you say it's terrific? Didn't you hear what the senator said?" Forget what the senator said. It's his legislative aide. He shook your hand. He said, "We're going to help you. Watch." And sure enough, he convinced the senator to change his mind. And as a result, we got the legislation we needed.
Back to your book, The Rising. Sure, I listened to what the politicians had to say. They were telling me that this sort of project, the rebuilding, was too big for a private developer, that only government agencies could get the job done. But I knew this wasn't true. The Port Authority hadn't built anything of significance in 4 decades. And look at the airports they ran, LaGuardia and JFK. They were monuments to mismanagement. They just didn't have the expertise to lead a project of this size and scope.
That's exactly the circumstances that I found myself confronted with at that time. And working with the Port Authority at that point was excruciatingly difficult. When it came to this liability parity legislation, they were there, didn't help in any way. And when I was advised, I got it. First thing I got was a call from Boeing Aircraft. They said, can we participate? Can we ask for your coverage from the federal government? I said, as far as I'm concerned, I have no problem with it. Sure, come on in. So we ended up covering Boeing Aircraft, and we ended up covering Logan Airport, because they were being sued because one of the two planes came out of Logan. So we covered them, we covered both of them. Port Authority never called, never participated in any way, except that when we made the final deal, we made the final deal to allow them to build Tower 1, right? People ask me, why did I do that? I said, because I knew we didn't have enough money. We wouldn't have adequate insurance company money to pay for everything, especially the Freedom Tower, as we called it then, Tower 1. And so, as part of the deal, we allocated Tower 1 to them. And that's when they wanted their share of the money that we got from the insurance company. We battled the insurance company for 22 insurers for 5 years. 5 years of litigation. And we never had any support from government, any support of any kind. It was just the most amazing thing to me. But end of day, as difficult as it was, the last 7 or 8 years of working with the Port Authority has been wonderful. Complete and total change. Because a gentleman by the name of Rick Cotton, new executive director, came on board. And breath of fresh air, a pleasure to deal with, a businessman, somebody who knew how to get things done. And working with him for the last 7 or 8 has been fabulous. So the first part of this experience was hell. The most recent 7 or 8 years working with Rick has been wonderful.
So approximately 7 buildings in your complex here at the World Trade Center. Who designed them?
Well, the first thing before determining who the architects would be was, what would these buildings look like? How many would there be? How much land would be allocated to a memorial park? All this had to be decided. Governor Pataki took the lead. And so, first, the governor thought in terms of having a competition, having outstanding architects come to determine what the massing would be of the site. And so that competition elicited different designs from different architects. And the design that was chosen by the special committee appointed by the governor to choose the final design, the governor decided he didn't want to go with their choice. So he chose Dan Liebeskind to design, to do the massing study of the site, which was simply not to design the buildings themselves, but to design the size of the buildings, approximate size, and where the buildings would be located, and how much land would be allocated to the memorial, and so forth. And so Dan Liebeskind, as we ascertained, had accomplished one significant design in the years of architecture in which he was involved. He designed a Jewish museum in Berlin that was brilliantly designed, superbly done, reflective of the Holocaust, of the disaster that affected the Jewish people, and did a first-class job with that. But he never designed anything over 7 stories. That notwithstanding, people just fell in love with his concept, the massing study, and the so-called design that he did for the different buildings. I got a call. Dan Liebeskind, he said, I'd like to come and visit you. And it's terrific. He said, I'm going to help you every way I can. We're going to work together, and we're going to be successful together. Okay. Not much time elapsed when I heard that he was now intending to design the buildings. And he said, Larry, I'd like to come up and visit with you. I said, sure. Came up with his wife, Nina, and they said, here's our master plan, which was fine. I said, we can follow that master plan. He said, but we're also going to do the building designs. And I said, Dan, you've designed a superb museum in Berlin. I mean, I couldn't ask for anything better. You've gotten recognition, worldwide recognition for what you did there. It's extraordinary. And bless you for doing it. I said, but you've never designed anything over 7 stories. His wife, Nina, said, he's a quick study. He could, in one afternoon, he could learn everything he has to know about high-rise buildings. So I looked at her, and I said, Nina, if you needed brain surgery, would you go to somebody who just learned everything he has to know about brain in one afternoon? Or would you go to somebody who's done it all his life and experienced it all? She said, my husband's a quick study, and it's not the same. I said, it is the same. And this is my decision. And as far as I'm concerned, this meeting is over. So they said, don't get excited. I said, I'm not excited. I just want to tell you, this is my money. I won it from, or I will win it from the insurance companies. And I said, as far as I'm concerned, this meeting is done. God bless you, thank you. I'll follow your master plan, because that was fine. I said, but you're not designing the buildings. I am. I'll pick the architects. So I remember then going out. David Childs was extremely helpful. He was the chief, I'd say he was really the lead architect at Skidmore, Owings & Merrill, a major design firm in New York and in Washington. No, not Washington, Chicago. And I'd known David Childs for some time. Just a good human being and a terrific architect. And so shortly after 9/11, I think it was April of '02, I asked David Childs to come in and help us design the new Sept World Trade Center. It was the last building to come down on 9/11, but the first building to go up. Reason for that decision, Con Edison had its substation in the base of Sept World Trade Center, the original 7. And Con Edison now no longer had any substation to provide electricity for all of lower Manhattan. So I got a call early on from the chairman of Con Edison, CEO. And he said, Larry, we have a terrible problem. We're providing electricity now with emergency generators. He said, we need to get the substation back in order. We need to rebuild it quickly. So he said, we got to get this done. So I said, okay. But while we're building the substation, we might as well go up with the steel and build the building, put it back. So it became the first building to go up after 9/11. Last building to come down, first building to go up. David Childs did a superb job in helping us design 7 World Trade Center. So I remember talking to David and saying, I said, what would be your reaction if I asked you to design all the buildings at the Trade Center? He said, it'd be the most incredible experience we could ever have as architects. What an extraordinary opportunity. He said, but as a friend, I tell you, not a good idea. I said, why? He said, because if you use an architect, you'll end up with what you've got, for example, at Rockefeller Center. Beautiful group, they did a spectacular job, but the language of each of the buildings is the same. He said, if you choose different architects, you'll get the language of each architect. One will play off the other, they'll work together, they'll talk to each other. He said it will be an experience that would result in a fascinating group of buildings, interesting, exciting, different in each instance. And he said as a finished product, it'll be a better product. So he said, I recommend don't give it to us.
In The Rising, Larry Silverstein, the owner of the World Trade Center, recounts some of the battles that it took over 22 years to rebuild the World Trade Center complex. And we want to close with this paragraph from the book. The discussions about the rebuilding proceeded with the combative, energetic spirit of the city itself. Everyone had something to say, a crucial opinion to share. And they all were, it often seemed to me, determined to drown out the voices of everyone else. But with Clara's support, I was able to continue my pursuit of my own inflexible goal to help make New York the city it is and the city it will be. I have devoted the last 2 decades of my life to bringing the World Trade Center back to life, to making sure that this city would honor its past and have a glorious future. And I look back at what I accomplished with a fierce and sustained pride. Larry Silverstein, author of The Rising, owner of the World Trade Center, thank you for hosting us here on the 80th floor of one of your buildings.
You're very welcome. It's a pleasure to be with you.
Well, thanks for listening to this week's Q&A podcast produced by C-SPAN. If you like the podcast, tell your friends, rate and review us, and follow us on social media @BookTV for more updates and schedule information.